Welcome to the 16th Imaginary Song Hunt, a monthly gathering of modern minds to reanimate lost songs from the deep past. So, as we move into the darker, rainier, colder part of the year, when eight-legged embodiments of evil from the depths of hell begin to infiltrate our homes, I'm feeling inspired to hunt down an especially creepy song. Which in itself depicts a hunt for a very small animal, a wren, not a spider. Although I did originally flirt with the idea of a spider theme for this session. I know a few traditional songs about spiders which I thought might be appropriate for the season, but folk song spiders quite often seem to be either very innocuous, as in the eensy weensy one, or vehicles for moral allegory, as in the one in the highly Christianized version of the folk song titled The Spider, which appears in Lucy Broadwood's 1893 English County Songs. In this song, a fly and then a hornet crash into an impressively crafted spider's web, provoking the narrator to reflect on the different life experiences of the poor and the rich. The fly gets eaten and the hornet smashes up the lovely web, and I think we're supposed to concur with the Reverend Canon Edward Mason, who disentangled, quote, and partially rewrote the song, as folklorists were wont to do, that it's better to be neither poor nor rich. Here's the first couple of verses.
It was one summer's morning as I lay on my bed, I spied an ancient spider spinning of her thread. She wove it in a sunny beam as clear as glass might be. The oldest nun that ever spun so fine as she. The first that came into the net, a silly fly was slain. The next that came, a hornet bolt, soon broke the net in twain. And so I oft-times wonder why are poor men brought to shame, while rich men live in vanity, and all men praise their name.
And just for fun, let's compare the last verse.
If rich men would advise it be, and stewards would be just, and to their tenants frank and free when they are put in trust, the hump from off the camel's back would easily be shaven. The camel past the needle's eye, the rich man enter haven.
These final lines, to me, seem unlikely to have passed muster in the communal filter of oral tradition, so I feel like I could make quite a confident guess about where Canon Edward Mason exerted the strongest influence. The thread between the spider's web analogy and biblical allegories about camels passing through the eyes of needles seems to have been rendered a bit incoherently in this mixing of folklore and fake lore. Anyway, even though the spider didn't quite fit with the spooky October vibes that I was in the mood for, it has given me a conceptual segue into today's song, the Cutty Wren, since it gives us yet another example of the folk tradition being used as a kind of ideological ink blot onto which we just can't help but project our own particular preoccupations. I highly doubt that the version of the spider that Canon Mason heard sung by peasants, Lucy Broadwood's words, was as biblically moralizing as the one that came to be published. But this coming together of Bible literacy with oral tradition has a long, long history in England, probably all the way back to the earliest English literature, when old Germanic heroic epics were forced to mate with the Christian ideologies of clerics who recorded them in ink on vellum. Songs in oral traditions are innately syncretic. We transform them when we transmit them. We tell stories about them that imbue them with a sense of personal meaning, and we manipulate them to serve ideologies that make us feel safe or connected to each other or right or righteous. If the imaginary song hunt has a memorable refrain that everybody can join in with, it's probably this: most of the stories told about ancient songs probably aren't true. Most of the stories told about ancient songs probably aren't true. Most of the songs told about ancient stories probably aren't true. Maybe not the best sing-along refrain. But they do reveal interesting things about the narrators of those stories and their beliefs. And that brings me to the big, exciting political story about the origins of today's song, the Cutty Wren, which Albert Lancaster Lloyd inserts into a compelling but largely invented historical narrative that stretches all the way back to Old English poetry. This corpus for A.L. Lloyd was the germ of English folk culture, which was forced underground by the nasty Normans and has been operating at the margins ever since. The repression of English commoners by the Norman aristocracy provides an opening to A.L. Lloyd's narrative of ancient class struggle, which reaches a kind of zenith with Wat Tyler's Peasants Revolt of 1381, during which A.L. Lloyd claims the Cutty Wren began to be sung. It's a grisly, allegorical song in which a wren is hunted down, cut up, and fed to the poor, perhaps symbolising a triumph over the privileged classes. So it would have made a perfect protest song for the rebelling 14th century peasants, if only they'd known modern English. This is a very cool story about a very cool song, which has been very widely repeated. But I expect you can probably guess what conclusion my small amount of research has led me to. But never mind that for now, because the truth is boring. So let's start with the cool song and then deal with the cool story and then the less cool true story. So for those of you who don't know the song, here's the gist of today's best known version. Mealder asks Mulder where he's going. Someone called Fessel interjects and says that they won't tell, but to someone called Foes, not to Mealder or Mulder. And then John the Red-Nose cuts in and spills the beans that they're all off to the woods.
Oh, where are you going? Says Mealder to Mulder. Oh, we may not tell you. Says Fessel to Foes. We're off to the woods, says John the Red-Nose. We're off to the woods, says John the Red-Nose.
It's kind of a complicated conversation, but a pretty simple song. Mealder asks Mulder what they'll do in the woods. Fessel won't tell. Then John says that they'll hunt the Cutty Wren. And Cutty, incidentally, is an old dialect word meaning little, so it's just like a diminutive epithet for the little wren.
Oh, what will you do there, says Mealder to Mulder. Oh, we may not tell you, says Fessel to Foes. We'll hunt the Cutty Wren, says John the Red-Nose. We'll hunt the Cutty Wren, says John the Red-Nose.
Okay, so you get the basic form. Question from Mealder to Mulder, a rebuttal from Fessel to Foes, an answer from John the Red-Nose. And it's John's contributions that yield the real wren meat of the narrative. So this quintologue continues. They discuss suitable weapons for the hunt, which increase in scariness as the song progresses. Then they wonder how they're going to cut up the bird, and the implements are upgraded from knives and forks to axes and cleavers, or sometimes boiling pots in other versions. And then, as the song draws to a close, Mealder wonders who's getting fed by all the wren meat.
Who'll get the spare ribs, says Mealder to Mulder. Who'll get the spare ribs, says Fessel to Foes. We'll give 'em all to the poor, says John the Red-Nose. We'll give 'em all to the poor, says John the Red-Nose.
And that's the crucial lyric that puts this into the category of protest song or rebel song for lots of singers and commentators. Of course, there are many versions of the song and the names and the details change, but killing a wren and feeding it to the poor seems to be the most consistent theme. In lots of variants, the people receiving the wren meat are described as the poor of the parish. Here's a version published by the Journal of the Folksong Society in 1914, which was transcribed by Miss May Morris and sung by, quote, an old nurse.
Come to the woods, says Rickety Robbit. Come to the woods, says Rickety Robbit. Come to the woods, says Johnny so long. Come to the woods, says everyone. What and do there, says Rickety Robbit. What and do there, says Rickety Robbit. What and do there, says Johnny so long. What and do there, says everyone. Shoot Jenny Wren, says Rickety Robbit. Shoot Jenny Wren, says Rickety Robbit. Shoot Jenny Wren, says Johnny so long. Shoot Jenny Wren, says everyone. What kill him with, says Rickety Robbit. What kill him with, says Rickety Robbit. What kill him with, says Johnny so long. What kill him with, says everyone. Powder and shot, says Rickety Robbit. Powder and shot, says Rickety Robbit. Powder and shot, says Johnny so long. Powder and shot, says everyone. How shall we go, says Rickety Robbit. How shall we go, says Rickety Robbit. How shall we go, says Johnny so long. How shall we go, says everyone. In a cart with 6 horses, says Rickety Robbit. In a cart with 6 horses, says Rickety Robbit. In a cart with 6 horses, says Johnny so long. In a cart with 6 horses, says everyone. What and do with the offal, says Rickety Robbit. What and do with the offal, says Rickety Robbit. What and do with the offal, says Johnny so long. What and do with the offal, says everyone. Give it to the poor of the parish, says Rickety Robbit. Give it to the poor of the parish, says Rickety Robbit. Give it to the poor of the parish, says Johnny so long. Give it to the poor of the parish, says everyone.
One of my favourite recordings of the Cutty Wren was released on Chumbawamba's excellent album English Rebel Songs 1381 to 1914, which, as always, I'll pop a link to in the spoils of the hunt.
Oh, where are you going, said Milder to Milder.
Oh, we may not tell you, said Vessel to Four.
We're off to the woods, said John the Red-Nosed.
We're off to the woods, said John the Red-Nosed.
The beginning of the date range in this album title, of course, comes from A.L. Lloyd's speculative dating of the Cutty Wren to the Peasants' Revolt, which Chumbawamba appealed to in their liner notes. It seems like their medieval-style harmonisation is kind of a tribute to this origin story. So here's A.L. Lloyd's account of the song's origins in his book, The Singing Englishman. What strikes most people about English folk songs once they get to know them is their deep melancholy. Their style of tune comes from the church modes of the Middle Ages, and it often seems to have stamped them unmistakably with the bitter sadness of the time of the Black Death and the baronial oppression of the 14th century. And before that century had come to a close, the effect of oppression and plague had brought radical changes in the relation of labourers to the soil and to their masters. The spread of a disease which, at its height, wiped out 1 in 2 people in London and 1 in 3 in the eastern counties, put the finishing touch to the Peasant Revolt movement in 1381. The outbreak of lawlessness which followed the dislocation of town and country life with its consequent labour troubles filled the green woods with outlaws and rebels. It was about this time that the people began singing a song called the Cutty Wren. Several versions of this song have been collected, each with a different tune and a fairly different set of words. The course of time has no doubt modified and altered this song, but of its character, enough still remains to let us form an opinion of its origin. Pretty certainly, this was originally a magical song, a totem song, which about this time took a strong revolutionary meaning. This is such an explicit and unequivocal statement of apparent fact that I instinctively want to give A.L. Lloyd the benefit of the doubt and assume that he was in possession of some compelling evidence to back it up. But there just isn't any. There are no surviving medieval transmissions of this song or any songs in English about wrens. The earliest known written transmission of the song is in David Hurd's Ancient and Modern Scots Songs of 1776 in Scots dialect. Incidentally, I'm not going to try and recite the words because I traumatised myself trying to read Scots in last month's Song Hunt. But I will tell you that in place of Mealder and Moulder, this variant has Fosy Mosey and Johnny Red Nosey. But there are no surviving texts in Middle English or Latin or Anglo-Norman or any other medieval language to provide evidence that the Cutty Wren or even anything remotely like it could date back to the 14th century. A.L. Lloyd basically made the whole story up. But if you Google the song or ask ChatGPT about it, then you're told that the Cutty Wren may date back to the Peasants Revolt, brackets, but this is disputed, which makes it sound like it could well be true, but some people disagree, which is quite a different scenario from the reality, which is just that someone made up a story. And so we have here yet another example of how misinformation spreads through the heuristic of appeals to authority. A.L. Lloyd was a hugely influential authority on English folk traditions, and so many things that he said have been widely repeated, which makes them seem indistinguishable from evidence-based theories. In Georgina Boy's words, the combination of doctrinaire political commentary and unsubstantiated historical generalizations in The Singing Englishman make the book a problematic read. I find the way in which A.L. Lloyd invokes this song in the service of a compelling ideological narrative really interesting. His narrative of the song forms part of a broad account of the origins of English folk song, which stretches back to Old English metrical charms. A.L. Lloyd interprets these as vestiges of the underdog pagan tradition, which was displaced first by Christianity and then by the Normans. In his historical overview, the Anglo-Saxon bards, who were made redundant by the Norman conquest of 1066 and with no exit pay deal, are the cultural ancestors of English working-class folk singers. While the French aristocracy and their jongleurs or court musicians dominated privileged culture, the inheritors of Anglo-Saxon musical traditions were, in his words, turned out on the country roads to ball, cap in hand on the village green. In his mind, anything light-hearted and bawdy in later Middle English lyrics is evidence of a surviving Anglo-Saxon creative instinct, while loftier tales of chivalry and Christian morality were, of course, French. For Lloyd, the historical thread of oppressed English culture continues into 14th century critiques of clerical and aristocratic authorities, which were made most famously by the Oxford cleric John Wycliffe. Wycliffe's followers, who were pejoratively labelled the Lollards, which means to mumble, opposed church hierarchies, rejected the doctrine of transubstantiation and the veneration of saints, and believed in individual personal relationships with God, which were developed through the reading of scripture in languages that were actually understood by the masses, so not Latin. Their movement was labelled a heresy and persecuted, with the usual burnings at the stake, before eventually being absorbed into Protestantism. With its emphasis on personal understanding of scripture and its dramatic rejection of papal authority, Wycliffe's alternative doctrine was kind of a natural counterpart to growing secular discontent against social injustices of the time, like harsh taxes, unfair labour laws, and the inescapable hierarchy of the feudal system. When the imposition of a very unpopular poll tax in 1380 triggered the so-called first popular rebellion in English history, the Peasants Revolt, the movement's effective spiritual leader, John Bull, was preaching Wycliffe's doctrine. And A.L. Lloyd's insertion of a modern English folk song into an idealised representation of this popular uprising reflects a common way in which folk songs are invoked to romanticise narratives of class struggle. Folk songs have often been conceptualised as the authentic, unadulterated voices of das Volk, the idealised peasant classes who become symbols of national and racial purity in the eyes of fascists or romantic nationalists, and plucky heroes of noble class struggle in the eyes of romantic Marxists. However, in fairness to A.L. Lloyd, I think it is quite reasonable to argue that there are firm foundations underpinning his positing of the Cutty Wren as a potentially ancient anthem of struggles against social injustice in the imagery of the song's words. Although there are no known medieval songs about wrens, the bird does feature in Middle English literature, and indeed the work of Chaucer, who was writing in the late 13th century, around the time of the Peasants' Revolt. In Chaucer's The Book of the Duchess, which is about the death of Blanche, the wife of John of Gaunt, whose policies helped trigger the Peasants Revolt, the wren serves a kind of comparative literary function. So the text has the lines, "The wren could sing as it were a nightingale, their tosche song full small and smaller," which means the wren could sing just like a nightingale, and her song was very small and gentle. In this context, birdsong is a representation of grief, John of Gaunt's grief at the death of his wife, and Chaucer seems to make the point here that this big emotion is expressed as truthfully in the small and subtle song of the wren as in the more famously beautiful and plaintive song of the nightingale. And this seems to be typical of the ways in which the wren has been treated symbolically in literature and folklore. It's only teeny tiny, but don't overlook it, because teeny tiny things can make a big difference. This is a lovely contrast with the mention of a wren in The Owl and the Nightingale, a hilarious Middle English debate poem in which the owl calls the nightingale small, weak and useless, saying, "What does the goddess among monne? Na more, the death a wretched ranne." What good do you do for humanity? No more than a wretched wren. Another famous wren story is a fable written down in the 12th century by Marie de France, in which the wren wins a contest to decide who will be crowned the king of all the birds. And she does this by cleverly hiding on an eagle's back and flying higher than all of the other birds, who exhaust themselves trying to outpace the eagle. The wren wins the contest through cunning, defeating the brute strength of the eagle. There are various transmissions of this same story from different parts of Europe, all of which emphasize that the little wren's cunning overcomes the eagle's strength. So the wren could well have symbolized the triumph of the underdog in the minds of rebellious 14th century English peasants who did face a David and Goliath level struggle against Richard II and his nobles to achieve the change that they wanted. And while we're on Bible stories, feeding the poor with one tiny little bird would have needed a loaves and fishes level miracle as well. The wren as an allegorical underdog, I suppose, begs the question, why kill it so brutally in the song? Why kill the underdog when you could kill the overdog? Well, perhaps because the killing of the wren represented a noble sacrifice rather than a righteous execution. Bird hunting was such an ordinary part of everyday life for medieval people of all social classes that the killing of birds wouldn't have been seen as indicative of a lack of love for those birds, I don't think. Birds of all sizes were hunted by the nobility, although larger prizes like herons, cranes, swans and game birds were probably associated with more prestige than little songbirds, which I expect were more the preserve of peasants whose hunting of game was, of course, restricted under the feudal system. So maybe the point could be that the hunting of a little wren demonstrated that the prizes the poor might aspire to were of equal value to those of the rich, since the little wren represented the triumph of cunning over strength, even if the rich overlooked them at their peril. I suppose there'd be no point ritualistically sacrificing an animal if you didn't value it. Okay, I'm clutching at very speculative straws here, but it is fun to probe bizarre allegorical songs like this. Some variants of the Cutty Wren treat the animal with more reverence and less bloodlust than others. In a field recording released by Topic Records in 1972, which I will include in the spoils of the hunt, Bill Whiting concluded his rendition of the song with this verse. Then on the recording you can hear him say, "I'm going to stop at that," and then crack up laughing before saying, "You can put in whatever line you like, you see." So maybe he just made that one up.
We must bury the remains, says Richard to Robin. We must bury the remains, says Robin to Bobbin. We must bury the remains, says John alone. We must bury the remains, says everyone.
Another significant aspect of wren lore that may well have been known to 14th century peasants is the wren's status as king of the birds, which it of course achieves in the fable by defeating the eagle. It could be that it's this high office more than the wren's reputation as a cunning little underdog that was the significant symbol in the song, leading to the bloodthirsty, non-reverential variants. If we accept that the Cutty Wren does date back to the 14th century, which we definitely shouldn't, by the way, then we could speculate that the wren, being a king of sorts, represented Richard II. Richard was still a young teen at the time of the Peasants' Revolt, so would have been aptly represented by a very small animal. The wren is linguistically crowned by an amazing number of languages, in which the name of the bird can be translated as some sort of king. Regulus, which means ruler in Latin, Roitele, which means little king in French, Riesuelo, little king in Spanish, Reatino, little king in Italian, Winterkoninkje, someone will hopefully correct me on that, Winter King in Dutch, Zaunkönig, which means hedge king in German. And this wren king archetype must go back very far to have survived in so many languages. Another claim for the antiquity of the Cutty Wren could be made on the basis of the existence of actual ritualised wren hunting traditions in Britain and continental Europe that are frequently said to have their roots in ancient Celtic paganism. Wren Day, the occasion of the hunt, is still celebrated, or at least has been revived, in Ireland and the Isle of Man on the 26th of December, the feast day of St. Stephen. Historical wren hunting traditions are also attested in England, Wales, France, and Galicia, although the practice died out in most places during the late 19th century. Thank God. In the past, men and boys hunted and killed an actual wren, stuck it on a pole, and then danced from house to house collecting gifts, which were sometimes given in exchange for wren feathers, because wren feathers were thought to bring good luck. The wren boys, as they were called, would sing processional songs as they walked, various versions of which have been documented and are still sung today. I'll sing you a transcription from Frederick William Horncastle's The Music of Ireland, published in 1844, which Cecil Sharp reprinted in 1916.
The wren, the king of all birds, St. Stephen's Day was caught in a furze. Sing hey, sing ho, sing holly, sing holly. A drop just to drink, it would cure melancholy.
Some traditions were kinder to the wren than others. In the Manx tradition, the day ended with a funeral for the wren. In Pembrokeshire, the wren was captured but not killed, and set free at the end of the day. I even read on one website that the wren was represented by a potato stuffed with feathers somewhere, but I haven't fact-checked that. In The Golden Bough, which is a huge comparative study of religions, first published in 1890, the Scottish anthropologist Sir James George Fraser described the ritual. The worshipful animal is killed with special solemnity once a year, and before or immediately after death he is promenaded from door to door, that each of his worshippers may receive a portion of the divine virtues that are supposed to emanate from the dead or dying god. Religious processings of this sort must have had a great place in the ritual of European peoples in prehistoric times, if we may judge from the numerous traces of them which have survived in folk custom. In Fraser's account and in others, we see the wren elevated from king to god, its death on the cusp of the new year probably representing the end of the old year. How anyone could ever possibly bring themselves to kill this darling, gorgeous, adorable little creature is really beyond my comprehension. And thankfully the revivals of the tradition in Ireland and the Isle of Man involve a stuffed toy wren, because otherwise we'd all have to go and be wren hunt saboteurs. Although the wren hunting rituals are supposedly very ancient, most of the surviving accounts of them date from the 19th century. Although, in his article, The Folkloristic Significance of the Wren, Carl P. Ventersdorf mentions a document from 1663 held at an abbey in France, in which it's described that a prior offers 30 pots of wine per year to the bachelors of the town if they bring him a living wren with 9 feathers in its tail. So this is pretty old and pretty interesting, but it's still almost 300 years too late for the Peasants' Revolt. So to loop all of this back to A.L. Lloyd and his grand story, The significance of the wren as a kind of David and Goliath symbol and the archetype of the wren king definitely predate the Peasants Revolt, even if neither the tradition of wren hunting nor any songs associated with it can reliably be traced back that far. A.L. Lloyd uses the song to creatively fill in some blanks in the historical record in order to tell a wonderful story, which, to be fair, is how history was written for the vast majority of, well, history. Historians of old were storytellers first and foremost, and propagandists when their patrons needed them to be. And now, when we innocently pop a query into Google or a large language model AI about something like the Cutty Wren, what we find is a brief summary collating lots of these types of stories which overlap and reproduce and intermingle to create a collective remembering that is filtered and sculpted not by what actually happened and what is factually correct, but by what the largest number of people find the most interesting. History is created in the same manner that A.L. Lloyd describes the creation of folk songs, in his words, out of the full flower of the minds of men as a community, as a class even. Not as solitary individuals, isolated like weathercocks on a steeple of genius. A.L. Lloyd's grand story of class struggle may not be factually accurate, but it is powerful and it is important and compelling. Thank you so much for song hunting with me today. You'll see a link to the song hunt tip jar in the video information. So if you've got some pennies to spare, please click the link and throw them in the jar, and I will catch you over on Zoom or some other time. Cheers, bye!